I'm honored to have had the opportunity to coordinate the DEI webinar and to be introducing Dr. Rita Fierro, the author of the book, Digging Up the Seeds of White Supremacy. I read this book in one sitting. It spoke to me. Several things informed, even impacted me. I appreciated the history of the systems and how they came to be, and the motivation of systems being from a fix-it mentality. And I found myself thinking about, I have to fix it. I have to fix me. I have to fix you. And how that mentality of systems is not an entirely productive process. What seeds were planted for me or you, like our family traditions, our politics, our sports, what seeds were planted by me for you, and which seeds flourish. Reminds me of that story of the wolves. Which one do you feed? So the ones we fertilize and nourish. I found it really powerful to review the systems that exist from three aspects that Dr. Rita presents: the personal, relationships or relational, and the greater whole or the wider impact. This book is designed to birth a movement that shifts the consciousness of our country and possibly our world. And I would say probably our world. I'm going there. And it's to move away from fear embedded in our institutions and the way our institutions reinforce its major effect, systemic racism. We are the ones we have been waiting for, and here's another opportunity for us to contribute to a shift in consciousness. And so let's grow together in consciousness with Dr. Rita Fierro, and beginning as we always do with a spiritual mind treatment, here's Rebecca Bell.
So please join me in this prayer. I often like to start, especially in the evening, with the reminder to get my head and my body in the same place. So breathe with me. Let's take a deep breath in and release. Knowing that that breath is the breath of God. That is what connects all of us, all of humanity, all of life is connected in the present moment, in the present and the presence of God. As I breathe, I know this to be true. I have absolute faith and confidence that God is here at all times. So today, in this meeting, in this blessed meeting, and exploration and exploration of topics that may be difficult, I say yes. I say thank you to the expansion of ideas. I say thank you to the expansion of understanding. I say thank you to the expansion of relationship that is both grown and continuing to be grown. I acknowledge and know that at any moment, the breath and God are in the present moment. So if there is any experience of discomfort in my body or in any body at all, we take a moment, notice it, and breathe, because God is here in the presence. God is here in the moment. Let's breathe that in together. So as we explore this genius book and this genius work by Dr. Rita, we may uncover things that are uncomfortable. And I say yes, embrace the new thought and the new experiences that are coming. Let's embrace that. And with great thanks, noticing the body feeling and the emotions in the body feeling, that is the place where movement and creation are happening. And that is a joy. A joy. And so I'm just grateful for this time spent together. I am grateful for all the seeds that are planted. I am grateful for all the seeds that are unplanted. I am grateful for it all, knowing that we each individuals are taking this information and this learning and into our own lives, creating it into bringing it into our communities as we are bringing new thought and new experience and new life into our world, as we do create a world that works for all, as that is what we are here. We say we are here to do. This is part of it. And I am grateful that we are all here together. I am grateful to be turning this over in a moment to Dr. Rita. And so with this grateful and excited and anticipation, I release this word into the law that says yes. that says yes. It moves forward, it grows, seeds are blossomed. And together we say, and so it is.
Thank you, Rebecca. How delicious. How really, really delicious. So I invite you to feel your bodies for a second. Like, let's us all just like feel our bodies, right? Like when we witness treatment, when we're in treatment, we have an experience in our bodies of expansion beyond fear. It's part of why we go to affirmative prayer in the hardest moments of our lives. And a big part of this work that I'll be sharing with you today is building the muscle of recognizing when we're in a state of fear and when we're not. Sort of like going to the gym. And so I invite us to think about, and we do this a lot in our spiritual communities, so that part of our work today won't be new to you. I invite you to really feel your body right now. Close your eyes for a second. Feel your belly, feel your heart, right? After hearing words of profound affirmation of everything that is possible inside of how divinely powerful and incredible we are as human beings, right? And I invite you, if there is a moment today where that shifts in the conversation, to just notice it. Not asking you to fix it, not asking you to change it, just notice it. Like, ooh, there's a knot in my stomach that wasn't here after treatment. What's that about? Ooh, there's a tension in my heart that wasn't here 5 minutes ago. What's that about? Just be curious about it for right now. Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to be on this call with you today. Thank you, Rebecca and Sharon and John and the whole DEI committee for having this be possible. There are some common faces, familiar faces from Center of Peace, Philadelphia. Barbara, I actually see you on my screen, which is wonderful. I can't see all of you on my screen because my screen's a little tiny. So I'm thankful to the Center of Peace for birthing me to new life. I've been studying systemic racism for 30 years, and I've been a child of the Center of Peace for about 15. And the journey I'm going to share with you today is kind of how these two journeys started to blend and how I discovered it was all one in my life. The first thing I want to tell you that kind of came through treatment is that what I'm up to is finding a spirit-led pathway to dismantling white supremacy. A spirit-led pathway to dismantling white supremacy, not just in our thoughts and mind, but all of our institutions and the foundation of our very country. And this history of systems, this thorough history that I went through of 500 years looking at 10 systems, taught me that in moments of crises, human beings came together to birth systems. They are not inevitable. They were created by human beings in states of crisis. And I affirm that we're in that state of crisis right now and in absolute fertile grounds to join and do some serious movement building around what our society can look like. And I'll start this story with a kind of a spiritual awakening for me. So one of the things I've been really committed to for many years is that I think there are two groups of people who are having really important conversations about how to transform our society. There are lots of spiritual communities like ours that talk about living beyond fear and expanding consciousness, and we often think about it as a personal. We don't often think about it in terms of what's happening societally and how systems were set in place to be rigid and actually hold people down and maintain a low state of consciousness. And then we have lots of social justice movements that have analyzed down to the last grain how all these systems were set up to disempower us. and often look at it from a space of other victimhood. And part of what I'm up to is to bring those conversations together, to weave them together. I'm excited to be with you here today because oftentimes I'm on the end of social justice movements talking about how to think in terms of consciousness. You already have the framework of consciousness. And what I'm here today to do is to say, let's look at the shift of consciousness personally and expand it to what our institutions are doing and to how we organize collectively. Because whether we're aware of it or not, there are structures that are there and are intended to keep us limited and keep us separated from each other. So the story of how a spirit-led movement comes to me, of course, has to come from my own experience. And so before COVID, I had tried, by January 2020, I had tried to get pregnant probably for the 10th time with a lot of support from my spiritual community and from practitioners. And I really believed it was going to work. I believed it with every cell in my body. I meditated each time beforehand, asked God if it was my journey, heard a yes. I went in with all my spiritual tools. I was profoundly committed to not force it, but to really listen if it was the journey for me, and if a child had a contract to be born through me. And when it failed for the 10th time, I felt cut at the knees. I was really angry at God. And my conversations with God went a little bit like this. How dare you? I was a good freaking girl. I played by the rules. I played by all the freaking rules. I did everything I could to not get pregnant in school. I did everything I could to get the job first, and the school first, and the PhD first. I did everything I could to always play by the rules. How dare you not deliver? How dare you not give me what I want, especially after I meditated and you told me it was my way. How dare you? I was pissed. And then COVID hit. And I, who had devoted these 30 years to my professional consulting business, and my consulting business was everything for me, lost all my work in a week. I was already in a spiritual crisis. And then I lost everything. And so suddenly I felt like I'd wasted my whole life. I'd actually wasted my life doing the things that I thought were important. And suddenly nothing felt important anymore. And reaching out to practitioner, minister, Reverend Twana, I started planting some seeds, because I started seeing that despite being a Reiki master teacher since 2004 and part of the Center of Peace for 15 years and talking about the universe and believing in prana and energy, there was still a white man running the show in my brain. It was a white man with a beard, and I was pissed at him. And so I started to grieve and cry. I had a lot of unshared tears, and I cried for weeks. And I stopped trying to push myself out of bed. I stopped trying to push myself to see it all rosy and positive. I gave up my spiritual bypassing of saying, it's all good, even if it feels like crap. No, it didn't, nothing of it felt good. I allowed myself to feel the profound grief. And although I knew that everything was in divine order, I allowed myself to feel as crappy as I felt for weeks and for months. And then George Floyd was murdered. And now, not only am I in this crisis personally, now I'm looking myself in the mirror and saying, what the hell have you done for 30 years? You don't have a message. You don't have a group of people who will listen to you. You don't have a pulpit. You have nothing. What difference have you made with 30 years of your work? What has your life been worth at all? And that question set me on a journey. The journey for me was this. I was not surprised when George Floyd was murdered. I'd been studying systemic racism for 30 years. I knew the numbers. I knew Black men were 3 times more likely to be killed by police. I knew that children in foster care were disproportionately African-American. I knew that children who were in foster care and juvenile justice at the same time were disproportionately African-American. I knew that children were being removed from their parents at higher rates, being kept away for longer times, and not being returned from African-American families more than any others. I knew these numbers. I'm a sociologist. I learned how to run these numbers quicker and longer than I'm running them to you now. I wasn't surprised. So the question became, if this is what the system produces, because I also looked at the African-American elders in my community and they weren't surprised either. The white women who looked like me were for the most part surprised because we had paused during COVID long enough to pay attention to the screen and actually feel the pain of it. The Black elders I knew were not surprised at all. It was just another murder to them, a painful one, but yet another. And so the question I asked myself is, if I look at the system as a tree, what are the seeds? Because we all know the fruits. Many of us are not surprised. We've been looking at them for centuries. What are the seeds? Because I stand by, if you know the seeds, the fruits won't surprise you. And so thinking about our work and the power of intention, I asked myself, what intention was embedded in each system when it was born? What was the intention? I'm an organizational development consultant. I help organizations work through cultural change and measuring their results. And one of the things I've learned is that the seed by which an organization is planted, the intention by which people found organizations or companies, outlives the founders. So if the founder was in a state of fear, members decades later will be in a constant state of fear. If the founder was fretting about money, members will be fretting about money. If the founder was fretting about diversity, the sons and daughters decades later will be struggling with the same themes. There are seeds that are planted so deeply in our institutions and in our groups that they outlive the founders. And so my question was, what are the intentions here? And with that, I'm just realizing that going with the inspiration I did what many of you guys know about as ministers, which is I bypassed my own agenda. That's okay. We'll come back to where I thought we would start out. So I knew that all these systems were connected this way. This book was founded on a chapter I wrote in my dissertation in 2006, where I started looking in particular at 3 systems at the time. And I was looking for patterns, similar patterns to how they changed to resist equality after the 60s. And so when I asked myself, if these are all the systems, and we know that every single system births the same result, which is disproportionate negative results for folks of color and disproportionate positive results for white folk, which means that choose any indicator of any system. Child death, right? Infant death, incarceration, juvenile justice, how long it takes for someone to get out of jail, how long it takes for someone to be served by choose anything that's negative, you will find people of color at a higher percentage than they are in the US population. It's called disproportionality for those who are familiar with the term. There's only one exception, which is Latinos seem to have better food habits. And so Latinos seem to have better health results than white people. Like that's the only exception. But everything else across the board. So I wanted to look at the systems not as different systems, but as branches of the same beast, because I argue the recipe is the same. The bottom line is the same. And what I found was this, that at the core of all of it was fear. When I looked back in time at the history of each of these systems, I looked back for the original seed. And I looked at it as the individual seed, the first action that was taken that set the route for the system. If you think about it as a road, it's kind of like the first plow, right? Like the first ditch that was dug up that then other people created a road based on. And then the collective intention, which I argue is the first law that's passed. Well, it isn't necessarily that I just used as an indicator because laws are in writing, so it's easier to look for, and there's always a collective action behind a law being passed. So I looked for the individual intention and the collective intention behind each system's birth. And what I found was that fear drove all of it. The core intention was fear in 3 variations: control, safety, and saviorism. The systems of control were born first with Christopher Columbus and him not only appropriating stolen lands, but also enslaving natives to try to make up for his bad investment, because he had come to the Americas hoping to find gold on the first shot, on a ton of debt and a ton of family debt, because his father was at risk of incarceration for his debt. So with a bunch of family debt and a bunch of people he had promised gold to, he arrives in the Americas, he doesn't find gold, and desperate, he says, okay, I'll bring these people with me to prove that they're docile and that they can be easily conquered. I'm not going to go too far into that. I just want to say there's something very sick about that reasoning, and that our society is based on white male trauma, I would argue. Because the only reason Christopher Columbus and his crew of 50 could survive is because indigenous people showed him the way to up and south, north and south of the coast, and gave him water. The indigenous people showed him where the fresh springs were, where the uncontaminated water was. Without it, Columbus and his crew would have died, either of thirst or contamination. And for me to turn around after you've given me water and you have allowed me to survive and decide to enslave you, there's something very sick about that. It makes me sick to my stomach as an Italian American in particular, right? Like that's the legacy of my people. There is that in the legacy. And then it gets baked into our society in a way that because he started it, other people can continue it. Because when in states of crisis, when things are not regulated, what the innovators do makes a difference. If there's no path, the first person who starts to plow the land will make the road. And he started to make that road. So the systems of control are born first. The systems of safety are born second. I'm like doing a really quick overview of 500 years of history here. And then here's what's interesting, is that after Europeans arrive, take away lands from indigenous people, and appropriate, kill, steal, enslave, then, and ship in Africans, Africans for them to be enslaved, then suddenly, after a society is well thriving with all this inequality, there's a class of poor that has been created. Now we create systems by which we're going to save the poor that we created, without ever questioning the actions that created the class of poor people to begin with. Because Columbus and all the pioneers are very clear when they arrive that Native societies know no crime and no poverty. So we created it. And after we created it, we decide we're gonna fix it by creating these organizations and systems and so on and so forth, but without ever going back on the actions that made them start to begin with. So feels like a pause right now. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the origins and kind of how this thinking came about. Before that, going to take a breath and ask you, so this is a Jamboard that I've been sharing with you all. And what a Jamboard is really a place where you can put Post-its and we can have a conversation visually and virtually. And so I'm going to put the Jamboard in the chat here. So for those of you who never used a Jamboard before, this may be new. What you can do as I'm talking or as you're in your breakout groups is that on a Jamboard, you can at any time create a Post-it. So these here in the corner are Post-it notes. And you can write on a Post-it note. I'm writing, this is interesting. And then you save it and it just kind of stays on the board. And the square at the top allows you to navigate on the different pieces of the Jamboard. So we're kind of beginning in the middle because that's what happened. And I'm going to continue for a little bit longer and invite you, if there are comments that come up, you can either write them in the chat or you can put a Post-it next to it in the Jamboard. And then we'll pause at some point and I'll ask you to break into groups and see a little bit like, what do you notice about this conversation? So the conversation is going to evolve this way. I'll go about 5 more minutes on the content of what I discovered and this discovery that this book became for me. Then I'll have you break out into pairs and just share, what do you notice? Like, what surprised you, basically. And it's just a light touch conversation so that this can seep in, because I know it's a lot of expansive thinking and sometimes it can be a lot of information all at once. And then we'll go into kind of what are the frustrations that you're experiencing in your own centers around DEI? And I'll offer you guys some solutions, and then we'll talk a little bit about what, like, we'll go back into breakout rooms and I'll ask you to think about what actions you're actually ready to take in your own centers. So this talk is specifically designed for us of CSL who are actively invested in a world working for everyone. All right. So I'm going to go back to, so I mentioned that what I saw in the end of doing this historical analysis was seeing fear at the center, and systems founded in control were birth first, systems of safety second, and systems based in saviorism third. So how does a society get founded? Right? Like, basically, that's what we're talking about. Like, how does a society get founded? We think of these systems as unchanging because they were founded so long ago and they're so steeped that we think of them as fixed, and they're not. Stacey Haynes, in a book called Politics of Trauma, says the basic human needs are belonging, safety, and dignity. This is what all humans ultimately need. When human needs, when belonging, safety, and dignity are met, we thrive as human beings. So this is what I discovered looking at our society. The fundamental principle to all the foundation of our society is that in order for the needs of whites to be met, and by whites, I mean people who have not experienced colonialism, not experienced the occupation of their lands, of their economies, and of their spaces. So the fundamental principle of all our society is that the needs of whites in order to be met, need to be met at the expense of people of color. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so what the system is this wall that is built between whites and folks of color that are designed, it's designed to safeguard the needs of whites against the needs of folks of color. And it's not necessarily so. A lot of us may say, well, isn't that human? Isn't it human to think that my needs have to be met at the expense of someone else? No. It's given in European societies, is it not given around the world? And so in Native societies, the structure was that if you tended to the needs of the land and you tended to the needs of community, the needs of the self would be automatically tended to. So Native societies are actually organized so that the land is nurtured and taken care of, and the community is nurtured and taken care of. And as a result, humans' needs are taken care of. So it's not inevitable to have a society that's based on this wall. We have created it that way. And I would argue we've created it that way because our society is embedded in white male trauma, which is that piece around what does it take for a human being to turn around and say to someone who has welcomed them, I'm going to enslave you and take you home. So the principles that have us believe that that wall is true, I would say, is blindness. We assume the wall has to happen. It has to be there. It's natural. Humans naturally go against each other. Humans are naturally non-collaborative. Humans naturally compete. All these beliefs about things being natural when it's actually white supremacy in action that we take for granted is the blindness. And then the illusion of separation, superiority, and scarcity. So people in our teaching talk a lot about the illusions of separation, superiority, and scarcity. What we don't talk about is how it's actually embedded in all of our institutions. It's not in our minds by chance. We are educated to continue it. And so if those three are, so if that's the tree, then the root, the seeds are the fear, safety, control, and saviorism. The roots are the illusion of separation, scarcity, superiority, and blindness. Then that's the soil that we nourish this tree by. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever tried to cut down a 600-year-old tree. There was literally a 600-year-old tree in Washington, D.C., and it took months and years. If you go at it one branch at a time, it will take an extremely long time. But if you change the chemistry of the soil, it may take you 5 minutes. And so the conversation here is the shifting the consciousness so that the soil changes. So here's the piece that Sharon was highlighting earlier is, if you think about this theory is called 3 lines of work in regenerative practice, everything expands from the self. So if you put fear at the center of a human being's life, then the nature of our relationships is going to become fear. And the nature of our world is going to be organized around fear. Our whole country is organized around fear. So what is possible? And what happens when everything is organized around fear and separation is this. You basically have 2 Americas. Each system has a specific way it handles the poor. The juvenile justice system has public things for the poor. We know in the education system, the public are generally where the poor end up. In the health system, free clinics. In the criminal justice system, at some point there were slave codes, and then there are state codes, and then there are disproportionate sentencing. Every single system has one way it handles the poor, and it has a different way it handles the rich. And what I'm arguing here is that racism is how Black folk get trapped into the system designed for the poor, whether they're poor or not. But the major separation at a systems level is between the rich and the poor. So we end up with a system like this, and we end up so separate in our experiences of the system that we can't even freaking talk about it. Because my experience of the legal system is not the experience of the legal system of a brother or sister who was born in a different neighborhood and doesn't look like me. And that's where the spiritual bypassing then becomes tricky, because then when we try to come to face with each other, then the other person says, oh no, that's all in your mind. It's like, no, it's not in my mind, it's my whole life. No, it's in your mind, change your mind, it'll change. It's like, no, because there's a collective conscious that needs to change for the institutions to change. And yes, it starts from our individual mind, but there's also a movement to be built so that the brother or sister that doesn't look like me can have an experience that I also would like of a society that's actually grounded in love. So what would a society organized around connection and love look like? I think that's the question. I don't have the answer. I think Indigenous societies have shown us some of how it can look, but there's also something to be discovered from how it can look now. And it's all about us getting to work to find it out. That's the collective work. So I'm going to pause here. And we will have time for questions, although I'm not going to do it right now. I invite you to go into breakout rooms in groups of 2, just pairs, and just share what you notice or what surprised you. And John, you can go for the breakout rooms.
Excellent. I'll open the rooms, and you would still be able to access the Jamboard while you're in your breakouts, if that's helpful.
Yes, and if you want to write on Post-its while you're on your Jamboard, they're anonymous, unlike the chat feature. So if you want kind of to share it either because you like me to respond to something or you just would like a notice of what you've been talking about, go for it.
Do you see, and I'm wondering if you're going to speak to this more, how science of mind or spiritual movement has been influenced by this, whether we're aware of it or not, and how we're perpetuating it?
I'd like you to bring that question forth when we share out, because I think it's an important one. And I think that at the bottom is kind of, which is why I was sharing my personal story in the detail with which I was sharing it, that there's grief that hasn't been shed, right? Like I think we as white people have plenty of grief around the harm we've done. And if we don't have it, we haven't really felt it yet.
Yes.
And so when we try to like blanket over this, I'm going to have a higher consciousness and focus on the positive, then like if the grief isn't expressed, it can't be transformed.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I don't think we can be really brothers and sisters who don't look alike unless we're willing to share that grief together.
There's music in my ears. I'm looking forward to hearing that process more.
Yes. Bring it back to us when we're in the whole group, when we share.
I'll do my best to try to remember how to capture that.
Thank you, Eden.
And it's Idan.
Oh, Eden, sorry.
That's right.
I should have known that.
No, it's good to be with you.
Absolutely. John, how many more minutes do we have before the breakout rooms are closed?
About 3 minutes.
Okay. Is there someone else who wants to share something that surprised you or something you noticed?
I was surprised. It never occurred to me, how did Columbus and, the people on those first, ships arriving, how they actually survived. It didn't occur to me that they had to have help in order to do that. And, so it's shocking to me that the very people who, as afraid as they might have been, they actually extended kindness, to these very strangers. And so it's like the level of the betrayal on top of everything else that came is just yet another surprise and shock.
Thank you for that, Lisa.
Yeah.
And connecting back to what Idan was saying earlier, if you look at the difference of the language from the first voyage to the second voyage, because Columbus had 4 different voyages, not one.
Mhm.
The Spanish crown had told him to stop enslaving natives, and he kept going. Because the Spanish crown didn't make a decision for the first 5 years. They didn't make a decision until 1500s that they were not going to stand behind enslavement. And in those 5 years, Columbus enslaved, and then he just kept going. But there's a shift from, and he also had a contract by which all the lands that he conquered would be handed down to his children. So basically, there's a monopoly on the Americas that happens for 2 generations of his families until the Spanish crown gets too threatened and basically takes everything away from him. And he sues the Spanish crown and wins. So there's like an intergenerational wealth that's created because of his actions. And there's a shift from the first voyage to the second, because at the first voyage, there was a boat that had been destroyed and 50 passengers were left behind to create this new town called Navidad. And Columbus goes on the second voyage expecting the people to be alive, and they've all been killed. And so now he starts seeing natives as having betrayed him. And so there's a shift in language from the first diary where it's very benevolent to the second where it's all, I have to look out for them. They're going to get me. They're going to kill me too. And then the fear really goes, like it starts with the fear of lack of money, and then it goes into the fear of safety, and it just goes in overdrive. Folks are coming back.
Got about 10 seconds if they're waiting for the clock to run down.
Thank you. Welcome back, folks. We had a little bit of a conversation here, dancing with breakdowns, with tech breakdowns, as we've all learned to do in the COVID years. Welcome back. I'd like to take a couple of shares. You can either share something that kind of came up for you that you're willing to share, something you heard that stood out for you. If you do it, something that someone else shared, kind of make sure that you do it in a way that they're not identified. But like something that really struck you.
Yeah.
I'm
So
bilingual.
Please use the raise hand function. That's great. Wanda, I see your hand up.
So it'll just be very brief. I think almost all of us, who, when we finally got together, there was nobody in the room for a long time, and then all of a sudden there were 4 people, and so we didn't have enough time to really share that much. But I think at least 3 of us shared that one of the most surprising things out of what you had spoken about, Rita, is the whole thing about Christopher Columbus, because everything we had ever learned in school, everything, I mean, you grow up and Columbus Day is a holiday for banks and stuff, and you think he must have been one of the grandest tigers in the jungle, and you just don't. It's amazing, and I have a feeling that there are a lot more Columbuses out there that we've not ever known the real truth. But yes, there were a lot of wonderful things in what you had to say, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Wanda.
Mm.
I keep saying this book kind of wrote itself in a year and has been teaching me how to live by it ever since. And I'm Italian American. I was born in the United States by Italian parents and have lived half of my life there. And Italians look at colonialism like, we didn't really do the real thing. Like we tried that whole thing in Ethiopia, but we're not really good at it because we don't know how to really do war. We didn't do that much harm. Mainly because of an inferiority complex that I think Italy as a nation has towards like France and England. And coming to terms with this like had to make me realize like Italian banks basically made it through money from enslavement. The Medici Bank that we talk about so much, and Florence, the Renaissance was funded by money from the enslavement. And because it's hidden behind banks, we Italians walk the world as if we didn't make a contribution, let alone that Columbus was Italian, right? Like, let alone that, and he had the banks at his heels, which is part of why he behaved that way. So there's something about us, I feel like we need to grieve the harm of our actions.
Beautiful. Rosanna, you have your hand up. You're muted.
There we go.
Yay.
Hello, I'm from
Yay.
East Bay, Oakland Center. I'm speaking for our group. We didn't really say who would speak, but the sense I got was that, a lot of us don't really even know what we don't know. We don't even know what we're supposed to ask. This situation and crisis going on in our country is bigger than we can even imagine. It's generational. It's been going on. I like that Dr. Rita said white male trauma. It's all trauma informed. It's learned behavior. You might not be the colonizer, but you definitely might get some privileges of it. Yeah. We had a good conversation. I'm complete.
Beautiful. Thank you. Idan, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. I had pondered in the chat if Columbus may have been the originator of gaslighting, because until he came along, the indigenous peoples did not have these problems that you're pointing to. And now even, I'd say our spiritual movement is unaware to a great extent of how it has not been immune to having been influenced by it. And like even just recently in my own spiritual community of this month being around thriving and suggesting that it's the individual's consciousness that is the problem, that I feel like is perpetuating that gaslighting, and was wondering what your thoughts are about that, Rita. And how to address that.
We'll go a little bit more into it when we talk about solutions. I love that you said the gaslighting starts there. I agree with you. I think it starts, there's basically this distortion that we white people do, that we want to feel good about ourselves. So we do harm, but at the same time, we kind of cover it up with something positive. And it definitely starts with Columbus. If you read his diaries, there are a few extracts I was sharing that are in the book, Digging Up the Seeds. If you look at it, he basically says at the same time that there's like, he was trading gold for a breecher's lace, right? Like kind of a trim off of someone's underpants, basically, exchanging it for gold. And the natives were accepting it because they thought it was something valuable. They're like, we don't know your world, so we assume good faith. We assume that what you're giving us is valuable in exchange for what we're giving you. But at the same time turns around at the end of the passage and says, I've never harmed them, right? Like, we've taken their lands because they are so open to us that they are not scared, and then turns around and say, we didn't really harm them. Like, I took everything. There's actually a passage where he says, I couldn't understand what they said because I don't speak their language, but they gestured that everything was ready for my taking. Right? Like, it drives me crazy. Like, if you read these passages, it's just so clear that mechanism of taking because I want, and at the same time, like, covering it up with a silver lining, yes, absolutely starts there. And I think we have to be careful in our teaching about, I think there's a fine line between saying all is good and saying invalidating the experiences of others. And we can talk about it a little bit more when we talk about solutions.
Thank you, Rita, for sparking all this conversation tonight, and awareness as well. So as a person of color who dances and straddles many worlds being of mixed race, there's this thing that I notice that happens within me whenever someone who is not of a marginalized community gets uncomfortable. I want to rush in and make them comfortable. And the conversation around fear and how it is basically the thing that has started and perpetuated everything, it's given me some compassion towards the past, because sometimes it's easy just to point fingers in the past and go, that's effed up, they started this, screw them, and now we're just all victims to those poor choices based in fear. But then the question is, well, why does it still perpetuate? We were talking about land and redlining and the value of things, and where I literally just flew home today from my childhood home that I'm helping my mother sell, is in a predominantly African-American neighborhood. They bought their home in 1977 for $37,000, and they're selling it for $41,000 in 2 weeks. 45 years later, like, really? And anyway, the perpetuation of things that I'm realizing with my own contribution to helping that stay okay by making people comfortable is not that I'm going to be like, F you, white people, feel uncomfortable. It's, it's your problem. But in terms of not perpetuating the evasion away from that fear and the discomfort. I mean, if we take it away from race and we take it away from the societal things, when on our own spiritual journeys for a moment, every single time I hit a wall, it was fear, it was uncertainty. It was like, I don't know if I understand God this way, but I had to stay with that. And that's when I broke through to some other side of insight and awareness. And so I want to be a supporter of transforming that fear and letting the fear be okay, not necessarily making it okay so someone feels comfortable, but saying that it's okay to be scared, that it's okay to, someone in our group mentioned that they just couldn't quite get everything. And another person in the group said, well, we haven't had to get everything, and it's hard to get everything. This is a lot of content. This is a lot of heavy stuff. And to let that be okay and recognize that that's not a symptom of us not being conscious enough. It's not a symptom of us not being good enough. It's a symptom of going to the edge of our understanding. And that is the very place that transformation is going to take place individually. And as we, celebrate that this work of Science of Mind is about the individual growth. But if you experience that discomfort as an individual, don't bypass it. Push into it, lean into it, embrace it, because that is going to actually contribute to the larger societal transformation. Even if in your mind, intellectually, you don't agree with how people are treated today, we are all contributing to the system. And I'm aware of how, as a Black male, I continue to contribute to the system. And I'm going to do some things to face my own discomfort and fear so that it doesn't perpetuate itself.
Thank you. And Linda, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. My question came up in our discussion, but it goes back to how you introduced the program today, Rita. And my question is, to what extent is a meltdown a prerequisite to having a consciousness that begins to see ourselves as a member of the universal one?
Thank you, Daryl. I love that question, Linda. Was there one more comment? Okay.
Not from me.
Okay.
That's it.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm not gonna answer that question right now. I'm intrigued by it. I'd like to pause for a second. And what was really important for us today, thinking about your centers, was thinking about, we've made this huge declaration as Centers for Spiritual Living of creating a world that works for everyone. And so we did this big picture thinking And now I'd like to kind of bring it back to our centers, to organizational culture, to what actions can we actually take. And so I invite you to, if you're on the Jamboard, it's on page 15. If you're frustrated with the Jamboard and don't really want to do the Jamboard, you can kind of do it in the chat and I'll cut and paste it. Without going into breakout rooms, just being together as we are here, I invite you to take a Post-it and share what is your greatest frustration around this topic. And what I mean is DEI and like JEDI in general. So justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. What is your greatest frustration as it relates to your CSL center and the kind of conversations you're in or not in? Again, you can choose a Post-it. If you double click on it, you can write in it and then save it. Or you can post them in the chat and I'll cut and paste them in the Jamboard for you. And let's do this just for 5 minutes. So for those of you who are not on the Jamboard, you can kind of see it on my screen here. You can start looking at some of the comments. As folks want to continue, you can definitely continue. I asked this question to a few people at a few different centers across the country before this webinar. And the things that I heard a lot of things about spiritual bypassing, about people saying, it's all good, we're all one, we don't need to talk about divisions, basically. And I also heard that the impact of that, and I heard a lot of frustrations around leadership not wanting to be involved. So DI committees being created as, like, we created a DEI committee, that's fine. Like, that's all that needs to do is there has to be a group of people who are having the conversation, but the conversation never really permeates leadership and everyone else. And then there's, the impact is a lot of folks of color leaving, a lot of folks of color who had entered leadership in this kind of rise up after George Floyd and kind of a lot of goodwill to contribute, and sort of this awakening, which I would say for white folks was, again, was an awakening for white folks for the most part. And so a lot of folks of color stepped into leadership and are now kind of in different places stepping away. And one thing that I heard pretty consistently is like a downhill of the DEI committees, like a crisis of the DEI committees, like these committees that really thought they were going to make a difference, step up the game, bring the centers to a new level of commitment for social justice, and then kind of hit the wall of either leadership resistance or community resistance or the bypassing, and then people feeling disempowered and somewhat hopeless in the face of it. So I was really grateful, and I'm grateful for the frustrations listed here. I hear a lot of things that bring back a lot of those conversations that I had ahead of time. There's a lot about white people not being clear about what our work is. And one of the things that I really feel called to do is to shift the conversation away from what do we need to do to help folks of color to what are our unresolved wounds that have us continue to create harm. Right? Because you can't enslave another if you are not enslaved ourselves, right? Like, we chose that course of action because we were enslaved ourselves. There's no way a free human being doesn't see a gorgeous tropical land and say, hey, let me make slaves, like, right? Like, we'd probably be playing in the water or something, right? So I think there's a lot of work that we white folk have to do, and I'm gonna stop there with that. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. So first, I want to remind you of this piece that I was talking about, which is in the 3 lines of work, which is regenerative practice. Regenerative practice has basically a bottom line of the reason that our world and our lifestyle is not sustainable is because human beings are the only products of nature that have stopped functioning like nature. We are the only products of nature that have stopped functioning and reasoning like nature. We think we are so apart from nature that we have lost our way. And so in nature, the way things prosper is from the center out. And if what we want is a society based in love, it has to start from our personal work. And then as we expand love in our personal practice, it expands into our relationships. As it expands into our relationships, it expands externally. And love is generally recognized from both sides as such, which means that if I'm talking down to a person of color and saying it's all love, and the other person of color says, no, you're shutting me down, I'm very likely shutting them down. Because love, we don't mistake love for something else. Like, love has such purity of an experience, it is not mistaken. If a person of color, or any person for that matter, calls us and says what you're calling love is actually fear, it doesn't feel like love to me, then we actually need to take notice, because there's probably some fear underneath it. So let's look at all three of these levels. What can practically be done? Lots of things, but here's what I'm going to propose with you today. So personally, I think there's some gymnastics here to be built. Choosing love over fear is literally a moment by moment thing. And if any of you think you have nailed this, I really encourage you to bring some humility to it, because it's not easy. And while we say we do it all the time, I'm not sure we do. And so if we're not in a place of love, that means there's a hurt underneath that has to be grieved so we can go back to a place of love, right? Or the fear has to be lived out to go to the place of love. Or we actively choose an action that makes us uncomfortable, because love doesn't mean being comfortable. And because all of our business systems and all our I'll go to that in a second. But we live in a society that encourages us to live from fear. Cover your ass, right? Create a paper trail. Be careful. Don't do the things that are going to get you sued. Don't babysit people in your own home, right? Like, we encourage people on a regular basis to do things not from love. And it means like literally interrogating on a moment-to-moment basis. And uprooting saviorism, superiority, and a fixing mentality. I argue that if we're trying to save any human being, what we are declaring is that we know better than them what is good for them. And to your point, Idan, about like, that's all over our teaching. I know better than you what's good for you. While as a community, we're trying to create a space of accountability. That's why we like try to hold people accountable to speaking positively, and that's beautiful. But it can't, when it comes from a place of superiority, we're actually feeding the beast. Part of what this book has really woken up for me is that anytime I move from fear, I'm feeding systemic racism. Anytime. Because it's the soil that the tree lives on. Because all our society is embedded in fear, and all our institutions are embedded in fear, all of our business practices and organizational practices are also fear-driven. So I was mentioning the cover your butt email paper trail, right? The moment you start being scared of someone, or someone shows behavior that is untrustworthy, we shift all email, right? Like, we no longer talk to each other face to face, because now I don't trust you, so I have to. And what that does is it builds up. So if I don't trust you, you don't trust me. And then it builds up the fear, and the fear expands because we create who we are, and we attract who we are, and we know that. So in terms of what we can do on an organizational level is being intentional about transforming our center cultures. It has to happen with leadership first. And leadership first means the boards, not only the ministers. Because change happens from the inside out. So if the leader is willing to do their personal work, and the board is willing to do our personal work, then that expands, it expands naturally. Like, one tree seeds 5 trees. But if you have a DEI committee in the corner who the leadership is not listening to and is resisting, you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to fit that wall. And a leader, by the nature of being a leader, has to feel like they are capable of leading. So part of why it has to be leaders first, which when I work with organizations and any organizational development consultant that works for culture change will coach the leader first. Because if the leader has their own personal transformation, then they feel capable to lead the group towards a cultural transformation. If the leader feels incapable because they have not had their own personal transformation, they will sabotage any cultural change at it every time. So create a team, I say. Like if you're really adamant about transforming the culture of your center, create a team, don't work alone. There's no I in team. This is not work that gets done alone. Systems have been created by groups of people. It has to be changed by movement building. And here's a tactical little tip about how to open up to your leaders if you find your leaders slightly resistant. Ask tons of questions about their leadership. What is important to you as a leader? What legacy do you want to leave? What's the vision for your leadership? And I would argue that because systemic racism is the backbone of our society, you will always find a way in which the lack of justice, diversity, and inclusion and equity is undermining their vision for their own legacy. That's where the dots have to be connected. If your leader is really adamant about environmental justice, we can't do environmental justice without people of color who are the most impacted by pollution and climate change, right? If what they're really adamant is creating a center that can face the complexity of our times, we can't face the complexity of our times if we don't talk about poverty, right? Like anywhere you look, anywhere there's a vision, diversity, equity, inclusion is there. And if you need to look at that map of systems to get clear and say, okay, which system is impacting the vision that my spiritual leader has for themselves? And that's the way to have an entry point with leaders. This is how this work impacts what you're up to. It's not you're wrong because you're racist and I've had enough. Although I get, especially for folks of color in the room, that's a very, you have had enough, righteously so, and it becomes exhausting. But it has to be a team of people who says, oh, now I really get what you want your leadership to do, and it's not going to happen unless we tackle this together. And as it happens at the level of systems, I would say systems change always happens in a team and always happens with a group of people. The one individual thing that you can do that's super easy is this. Take a look at your 401ks. Our United States system, our retirement is an ongoing investment in a state of war and poverty in the world. Most of our 401ks are investing in companies that make war. And it doesn't matter who the war is with, because we don't really, despite what the politics will tell you, we are just invested in war. We are invested in keeping the world in a state of war. Look at your 401ks, try your best to invest in the things that actually you are committed to for humanity. I have a big thing about not investing in tobacco companies because I spent some time in Africa and I know that the tobacco companies are aggressively marketing to children in Africa. Like showing up at elementary schools because Europe is smoking less and the United States is smoking less and Asia's maxed its capacity. So the new frontier for tobacco companies is Africa. I will not invest in tobacco companies. It's very hard to not invest in war companies because even the tech giants have contracts with military. So it's very hard, but I still invite you to know, at least you know the ways in which you can. Oh, I love that question. What is the Science of Mount Foundation invested in? That would be a great low-hanging fruit to look into as collective action. Look where the endowment is. I invite you to build, I'm going to go back to one here. I invite you to build the capacity of a team, not alone, although reading a book is great. I invite you to do it as a team to see the system as one. Because one of the ways that systemic racism reinforces itself is by having us believe that these systems are all separate. They are all connected, they are one. And I invite you to, and it's a lot of stretched brain thinking for lots of folks. We have been trained to not think that big. That's how we stay blind. So build your capacity to see that bigger picture. There are ways that you can do that by, just to start, by reading the whole book, Digging Up the Seeds of White Supremacy, because it's the only book I know of that's looking at that levels, but there are others, right? There is the New Jim Crow that looks at 4 or 5 systems at a time. There's more on the horizon in terms of how systems are connected. I know a lot of CSL centers have organizations they donate to. I invite you to donate to organizations that are actually out for systems change and transformation, and that center their actions on the voices of people themselves who are impacted. So invest in organizations where people impacted are making the decisions, not where people who are trying to save them are making decisions for them. And with that, I invite you to type into the chat, what kind of actions do you feel like you can take on? Like one action that you can take on in your center, one next step that you're willing to take to move this conversation forward. Yes, David, I am coming to CSL in the spring to Atlanta. So as you think about actions, here are some ways that you can support my work in particular. You can invite me to speak on a podcast and continue this conversation and dig deeper on the spiritual twist and terms. I'm planning spring. I already have Atlanta and Long Beach, California on the agenda for spring. I'd love to come speak at other centers. If you want to invite me over, I'd love to be there and come. And if you can add an invitation at a local bookstore, I think that would be phenomenal. It would help put the book out to more and more people. I work with organizations. Consider like hiring me as a coach or a consultant to work specifically with your center for systems change, for culture change. And as a present to CSL, because I love what we're up to and who we are as an organization, and on Sharon's invitation, so like shout out to Sharon, I created a guidebook to help guide a book club that wants to form at your center to read through the book together. And it's a series of exercises and questions to help shift the thinking into action. I ask as a reciprocity for using the guidebook. We'll send it out as a link afterwards. There's a space for you to comment. I invite you as you read it to comment on how it's working or not working for you, because I think at some point it's going to be public and released to the public. So if you could just help me produce it in a way that works for you as a reader, I really would appreciate that reciprocity. You can ask your library to purchase the book. You can sign up for my mailing list, drritawrites.com, or there's social media over there. And we are at time. I wonder if folks want, I want to both be respectful of time and give folks space to share. If folks want to stay, I would say 10 more minutes. We can like kind of bring further comments. If people have to go, no worries. If there are folks who want to ask comments or questions to just kind of wrap this up with your voices rather than mine, I'm happy to stay like 10 more minutes. Does that work for the DEI committee?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, that's fine.
So I'm willing to take any kind of question, but I'm especially intrigued by the conversations for action and what's kind of next for you and what you see. Thank
have a
you to
question.
everyone who's saying the thank yous. Go ahead, Catherine.
So I'm in Pasadena, California. We have a center here. You're going to be in Long Beach. How do we get you to come to Pasadena? How do I do that?
Put your email in the chat and we'll talk offline.
Okay.
Thank you, Catherine.
Idan,
Yeah, so I would love to do a book study on this. I had challenges just doing a book study on my grandmother's hands because it can be so inflammatory, but having, I hate to say it, white supremacy in the title, it's like, I'm afraid it's going to get really big pushback, and I'm not sure how to address that. I'm hoping all of us here can help, address that. And, like I've tried to help people to get, to just realize it's any type of supremacy hurts us all. But yeah, any thoughts about that? Because that's one of my big obstacles, is helping people to get over that barrier.
Idan, I'd love to talk with you more, and maybe again, like, who would be the team at your center that could steward this, so you're not working alone and you're not shouldering it alone. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you all and see, kind of based on where you are, what would actually have it fly. The other thing I want to say is that I strongly believe that we have to work with the willing. There's plenty of work for those of us who believe we're in the work and believe we're doing our best, right? Like, remember, 30 years of racism, of studying racism. And I had so much entitlement wrapped up in my relationship with God, I had no freaking clue, right? Like, there's plenty of work for those who are willing to do, that I'm really committed that, we start working with depth and authenticity and realness with who's willing. I'm not interested in convincing anyone who isn't. So let's have a conversation and see kind of what we could create from there. I just invite you to bring to the conversation some folks who are in the work with you, so you're not alone.
Just a quick aside, would you be open to sharing with my therapy community?
Absolutely. Who's talking?
It's Idan.
Yeah, it's still Idan. Okay, somehow I didn't see your lips moving. That's weird. Okay, yes, I'd love to share.
Okay, great.
Put your email in the chat, Idan, so I know to follow up.
Okay, I'll just email you. Thank you.
Yep. And anyone who has similar questions about me speaking somewhere else, just write your email in the chat, and so I know to follow up with you. Any other comments or questions or ideas about how you can move this forward?
I need to raise mine.
Hi, Reverend Jacqueline. I heard your voice.
Hi. I was looking
Jacqueline
for
or
my
Jacqueline?
hand to raise.
No worries.
Hi,
We heard your voice. Go for it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a conversation of renewal for me. Just thumbnail quickly. I was one of the founding members of the original Diversity Commission. It's been 10 years for CSL. Secondly, to everything that you're saying, just thank you, just much gratitude. And I want to encourage the Diversity Committee to continue in this role of being a steward of diversity, equity, and inclusion in CSL. That I know sometimes it seems like nobody's listening, which is just more of a clue of the importance of the work, of the pushback. And I also want to invite you, and I put all my information in the chat, to my community at East Bay. And the final comment I would make is we at East Bay have something called a sacred activism ministry. And that is inclusive of this work. And again, just thank you for the spiritual anchoring of this work. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm looking forward to meeting and working with you. Thank you. I'm complete.
Thank you. That warms my heart. It's such an honor to be here. Like, I feel like CSL birthed this in me, so through me. So it's really an honor to be able to bring it back. Katie?
Thank you. I'd like to add my gratitude. The work is cathartic, healing, joyful, and validating. And I'm so appreciative. I live too far away from a CSL center to attend in person, but I Zoom in. But I am working with a group, and they've been together for a while, that are willing and are really looking. And they ask me to ask for greater languaging when you're really looking at white savior, superiority, fixing, and you're really looking at all of those issues, some concrete guidelines or thoughts to distinguish that from when you really begin to see, when you're out in your community and saying, I refuse to be complicit. And there's a real difference between saying, I'm going to see this and not be complicit, and fixing. And I think more languaging around that would help us.
Nice.
It's a lot more complex than that, but a little quick answer for now is that people who are directly impacted themselves like the idea. Not one person, but several people. So Home for Good Coalition, which is an organization I co-founded, we kind of work on transforming systems, putting the voices of mothers who lost their children to foster care at the center. And yeah, we have supporters, but if I have an idea and the 3 mothers say no, it's a no. Like their voices as people who are directly impacted trumps mine as a leader. And so it's a lot more listening in that regard. But there's more, right? But that's just like a kind of quick indicator. I would say if you find not just a person on the street, but an actual organization that puts at the center voices of people with direct experience, if it's criminal justice people who have been incarcerated, if it's juvenile justice people who have been in the juvenile justice system, and it's an organization that puts their voices at the center and has them on a steering committee, on a board, and so on and so forth, and they say no to what you think is a great solution, we need to back off when that happens.
Thank you.
And I think Laura Lee, and that'll be the last, we'll close there.
Rita, thank you. My name is Laura Lee Bentel, and I am a member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. I do belong as a practitioner to the Tacoma, Washington Center. And I just, as an Indian woman, I want to raise my hands in honor to you, because you as an Italian woman coming here, knowing about Columbus myself, I want to thank you. I just want to thank you from my heart. In Kus Bu'us, we are all one heart. And I mentioned this earlier, and I think about this often because I do a lot of work within Indian country throughout the state and throughout the United States, is that what would have happened? What would have happened when the colonists came over and they adopted our way of living? You know, but you know, I'm one that stands in the truth of the matter. I continue to educate. I continue to teach. I continue to learn. So thank you. Lemlets.
I'm honored, Laura Lee. Thank you. I'd like to continue the conversation if you can put your email in the chat. And yeah, part of this big thing about this book was realizing why Native Americans have been so adamant about Indigenous Peoples Day, is because there's a precedent that was set with Columbus. And if we celebrate the precedent, we celebrate everything that followed. So thank you. And thank you to you and your people for stewarding this land as beautifully as you have, despite all the harm we've done. Thank you, everyone. It's been an absolute honor to be with you all. And I'm looking forward to how our paths will continue to cross. You have my information. You can look me up. Feel free to drop an email anytime. Love to you all.